Sound check. Sound check. Alrighty, my shows are always so professional. I'm always so right on top of everything. I got everything working out properly, and sound is always, of course, perfectly spot on. Ha ha ha, funny, funny. Alright, this is the Game Master Soapbox. I'm your host, Jonathan Albin, also known as Game Master J, and this is Nikos RPG. And right off the bat, I want to remind you of our sponsor. Logo's down here in the corner. I think this is the right direction to point today. Yeah, over there. Yeah, okay, there you go. Board Game Paradise, a store in Redlands, California. I operate role-play games there on Monday nights and Tuesday nights. If you are interested in a live game with us, feel free to show up at Board Game Paradise, 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. Mondays and Tuesdays. Tuesdays is a brand new campaign, so if you want to get in on the ground floor of the Nikos experience, we are starting iteration 9 with that session. Alrighty, we are, as usual, going to talk about a series of subjects for about 10 minutes apiece. 10 minutes apiece. I don't know why I must be craving fruit. I must have fruit, yes. Well, I still haven't fixed my cough button. I don't know how to use it yet. So one of these days I will figure that out. Today we're going to talk about how to start a game. The first couple are going to be specific areas in reference to the types. And then I'm going to talk a bit about, so in other words, I'm going to talk a bit about establishing a sandbox environment. Then I'm going to go discuss how you can create a railroad mechanism within the game. I know that by mentioning both sandbox and railroad in the same show, I might very well melt the internet. So if you are of either camp, I would recommend you take a chance to watch this entire episode and share it with your friends and get their opinions. And by all means, if you like what you're seeing on the show and on this podcast and this network, please like the video, click the oh gosh, I'm so good at this. I'm so good at this part. The call to action. So yes, like this video, click the so I'm so good. You can I'm going to say submit. That's not the right word. Goodness gracious. Like and follow our show. Click the follow for the individual channel on Twitch. And when you see this video on YouTube, make sure you join us by clicking the submission button. And see, I did it again. Submission. Yeah, I'm so professional. So professional. Anyway. And you can also click on the bell and make sure that you get notifications every time we put out a new video. And we'd also appreciate any commentary you want to share with us, because that also aids with the algorithm finding us and getting us to more places. This program, of course, is a series of segments that support the game master, the player, and even aficionados who just like to watch the shows, and gives you a little bit of information on how to improve or enhance your role-play experience. So beyond establishing a sandbox, creating a railroad, I also want to talk about the erosion that I'm seeing in the play environment. And this may be the broadest category that I've talked about in a while, but the very environment of play is having challenges, and we're going to go into some of the reasons and ways we can avoid the erosion in the future. I also want to call back to a period in role-play games history the period known as the Satanic Panic, which of course influenced our culture here in the States in particular, not only about role-playing games, but rock and roll music and other uh, social pursuits. And I want to talk about the respectability of role play and how that's been affected not only by the Satanic Panic of that time, but how the process of role play has become, in part, more respectable and has also suffered at the same time over the period since then. And then finally, I want to talk about the ethical considerations in an RPG, and this is something that if you are a game master, you may want to particularly pay attention to this part near the end, because I want to talk about how it is you can have an influence on the overall RPG environment and do what you can to improve the play experience. Finally, we're going to do the rant last this week, and the rant this week is going to be the very argument made by players of an appeal to motive. And those of you that know what I'm talking about, it hasn't been rearing its head as much recently, but in the past it has definitely been a great, or I should say great, but a massive point of contention between the players and the storytellers in terms of what their characters are doing within the story and what their outcomes will be. So the rant will go on for a bit there. Of course, at the end of the show, before we sign off, I will be willing to take any questions of anybody that places those comments in the chat box here. And if I don't see any, of course, I'll also make a feeble call to action for the Saturday session as well. I say feeble because I haven't been effective with that, and to date we haven't been able to pull players together for that. And I'm nothing if not determined. So again, Saturday between you just notice I got a glitchy here. Didn't notice those dots before, so I must have written a longer title than that. There we go. Improved it. All right. Ethical considerations in the RPG environments. All right. There we go. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the RPG Open experiment on Twitch on Saturdays. That'll be Saturday morning, 10 a.m. Pacific time. Every Saturday, we're going to try this until I can get it up and running. And I think it'll be a revolution in the way roleplay is done via the Twitch channel. So we'll see how that goes. Alrighty. Getting ready to rock and roll and start here. We're going to talk about establishing a sandbox. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with what a sandbox is, the very concept of a sandbox is exactly what it kind of sounds like it is. A sandbox, as you may recall, in the playground when we were kids, was an area where you could create specific environments for the toys that you had with you in the box, whether you had shovels and played at the much macro level, or if you're talking about bringing your trucks and cars and establishing the environment within that space. Well, a sandbox doesn't have a framework or a story involved with it. The sandbox is literally, I put together the playground, if you will, and the players, you guys then interact and drive the story forward. And when you establish a sandbox environment, the first thing you have to make sure you do is to establish clearly the boundaries of the sandbox. If you are going to make it a global event and you want there to be globe trotting going on and people traveling from point to point to point within the world, you have to let them know what their frameworks are, what their boundaries are, what their limits are. Because if you do not establish the limits, the players will immediately walk to the edge of the board and jump off. I don't know how to express it, but we as players want so much to have agency that we decided the best way to do that is to prevent the storyteller from boxing us in. So the very idea of a sandbox is in actuality not a box at all, but should be a open area where the players can just run wild and do what they want and build their own story within the frame. Establishing a sandbox, therefore, is difficult in that if you are a storyteller and you are actually creating a theme or a message that you want to be explored, you have to put enough prickly bits into your story that the players will want to pick up and run with, the pieces that will enable you to actually prevent those pieces as you intend. Now, there are game masters I know, and I'm not one of them, who simply draws the parameters and the lines and then uses a random number generator to determine the creatures and beasts that the players might run into, and tries to, as much as possible, allow the environment to react to what the players do, and provides them with the engine elements that will cause them to actually drive forward. From my experience, those true sandbox environments that give you no guidance or direction to travel in are some of the slowest types of games to get started, because players, especially if they're not familiar with the sandbox, if they're not familiar with the elements that you have at your arsenal, they have a hard time figuring out which direction to go. As a matter of fact, many players say and claim, and sometimes loudly proclaim, that what they want is a sandbox environment. But generally, those persons that have a sandbox in mind aren't actually looking for a sandbox. They're looking for a place for their story to be told. Now, my knee-jerk reaction, my emotional reaction to that is, if you want to be a generator of a story, then by all means build your own sandbox with your own framework, and you element and guide the story. But to me, I have to create a sandboxy kind of environment so that the players can see that they are free to take their own course and move their own direction. The biggest difference between a sandbox, I suppose, and a railroad is that the sandbox will have events that are going on. In many ways, it's like a video game that has a through line story, but that the players are not bound to it. The elements of the story will activate whether the players are apart or not, and those through line pieces become just noise in the background, sound that the players could be drawn to but are not compelled to. That really is the difference between a sandbox and a railroad. But the sandbox, the creation process, not only includes the idea of the framework and the limitations that you have internalized to make it the kind of sandbox you want, but you also have to establish enough operating points within for the players to get a purchase. What I mean by that is they have to be able to put their feet down and know that if we travel X number of days in that direction, we will get to an objective that's been defined for us, but not a mandate. And so if I go in another direction, then there are other things to be discovered. The benefit, the attractiveness of the sandbox from a game master standpoint is that you are not driven to find ways to lead the story forward that might be misconstrued. Hey, Sea Goat, nice to have you with us. Glad to have you. Hi. So the sandbox elements that you need to create, obviously foundation framework. You need to have an established number of recurring player characters, or RPCs, that the player characters can interact with. You'll find that when I talk about NPCs, I have a graduation between them. I have the true non-player characters, which are the window dressing. They're the pieces that you they're almost obligatory. You know, the stable boy, the bar mistress, the drunken wino on the corner. All these kinds of almost ubiquitous NPCs that really no one's concerned with and not interacting with, and therefore don't have to have a name or a background or they don't have a compelling reason for being there. Then there are the SPCs, or story PCs, and these are the individuals that may have a name. They may be have some kind of what I call a greasy hook to them, so that the players will want to go and interact with them, but only for the purpose of gathering information, and then they are fundamentally discardable, if you will. And then you've got the RPCs, or recurring NPCs, and the recurring RPCs are your fundamental basis for week over week play, especially in a sandbox. This would be, for example, the landlord. If the characters in your game are going to start from a centralized location and they're going to rent a operational base, or they're going to purchase a base, you need to have somebody that they can interact with that becomes familiar to them, that they can almost depend on, and they know that they can find to gather information and such like. So once you've established the sandbox framework, and you've established your group of RPCs and SPCs for what you want the players to find, then the next thing is to figure out what kinds of drivers can be in place so that the players can lean on those rather than their own. So, for example, if there's a town crier who's going to announce the interesting things that are available in the city in this week, then that becomes one of your RPCs. And if not, maybe there's a signpost that they go and read every day, or there's the scuttlebutt in the restaurant that they go to for breakfast, that kind of thing. You have to develop the means of gathering information, because the players in a sandbox are going to want to have something to drive against, something to push back on. And so the recurring player characters and the static locations are kind of important to a sandbox. Final thing that you really need to have when you're creating a sandbox environment are foils. And by that, they're not necessarily direct opposition to the players, but they are alternative agenda driven folk, whether they're recurring PCs or SPCs that the players interact with or bump into, that give them the mechanism for driving the story. In other words, if you are going to say that they are going to be a mapping crew and they're going to go into a certain unmapped area and record what they discover, then you have to have somebody to whom they report, bringing back the maps and such, and rewarding them for that process. In other words, to keep them moving on again, the unstable ground of a sandbox. So once you've established all of these things and you've given them a place to go, then you certainly have to be able to interact with the players, and so they need some way to feed back to you what they want to do. So in some cases it's a weekly report. I sometimes use my Our Story So Far portion of the game to have the players interact with someone with whom they are filing their ending report from the previous week, so therefore you're refreshed on where the players are thinking, where they are headed, and such like that. Or you do it as an after action report and a debrief, where you're gathering from the players how the experience went, what things they did accomplish, and what they're going to be thinking of in the future. Either way, whether you're backloading it and having the players give you the information at the end of the week for your planning, or if you've already got everything planned, then you have to have a way to get a gauge on what the players feel that they've already accomplished. You can do it in the front loading for the following week. Okay, so next we're going to talk about is establishing a cleverly created railroad. And I know all of the sandboxers out there are going, "Oh no, what's he talking about? Nobody wants to create a railroad. What are you doing?" But here's the element that I'm trying to get at. A cleverly created railroad is a railroad mechanism that does not manifest as such, but instead as a tacit and tangential guide to what's going on in the world of your game, in such a way that the players will move inexorably down that course. Now, a true railroad doesn't require the players' advocacy at all. What's considered to be the classic railroad is you cannot do point B actions until you get to point B, and to do that you must have completed point A. Most modules, at least in the last decade or so that have been created, are built on this model, where you are going to go from point A to point B and you must accomplish these 3 check marks along the pathway in order to unlock the new boxes that open at the next rail station. So to do this more creatively and more cleverly, what you want to do is establish the railroad almost as a subterranean. And what I mean by that is beneath the prime story. One of the ways to do this is to have an established clock. And what I mean when I refer to a clock is a set known action that is going to happen inexorably and that the players must, along the path, connect with. And to set these clocks up, you have to, just as in any scene, you must set an establishing shot. There must be some action or story element that the players interact with that lets them know that the clock is starting, and you have to have some way of week over week measuring the progress of said clock. The clock mechanism, this concept of setting up a pre-appointed time for an event to occur, can work extremely well if you're using a cogent timing system. So every week session is somewhere between 3 and 5 days long, with a break in between for training or whatever. And in that process, therefore, you are establishing a rhythm, a metronome, if you will, for your players to follow. All right. Now, when you create this railroad, you don't want it to be visible. In other words, a player who is aware of the stations of a railroad will avoid them like the plague. So the clock mechanism, if it's going to be utilized, has to be set up in such a way that the players pursue it on their own. Which is, like, for example, one of the great wins that I use is I'll set up an established, event, like a major party, major astronomical event, major something that the players, even if they're not wanting to directly follow, are going to see in the corner of their eye and recognize that it is progressing towards its objective. You can do this with stellar objects that are, spatial objects that are moving through the vision field in the evenings, and therefore they can see the star moving more and more towards a pointed location or whatever. Other ways of doing this would be to have non-player characters, other groups, for example, that are coming back with reports on how it fares, how the timeline is moving in those other places, and it gives that feel of a drum beat or a rhythm or a pattern that the players can work off of. Now, I don't know if you've ever traveled by rail. Most of us have at some point been on a train, even if for a very short period of time. But the concept of being on the rail is the idea that you're moving at a metered rate from one point to another, and generally there's some kind of sonic inclusion, whether it be the click of the rails or the chug of the engine or the sounds of the places that you're passing by. If the players are in an environment that has been defined in a sandbox context, the railroad cannot be a mandate. You cannot say, well, yes, we're going to play a sandbox, but you have to be at this point at this time doing this thing, because that's the very opposite of a sandbox. So it's far better to have the thing, whatever it is, be the equivalent of a automobile collision on the freeway, so that everybody has to stop and look and see what's going on. This looky-loo effect does draw people into acting or interacting with the story element that you're trying to build. But that process, the clock, is one way of doing that. Another methodology for cleverly creating a railroad is to physically change the locale. If the group has not said that they're specifically traveling, have things travel around them. A traveling circus that comes by, a marketing caravan might come by, religious zealots on some kind of recruitment process could be brought to the fore. In this case, what you're doing is you're not actually causing the players to move down the railroad, but you're bringing the spectacles, the fancy elements to the story by placing it in front of them. And while this doesn't effectively create a railroad, it does in theme, because you as a storyteller are still getting to draw attention to the pieces that you've been looking for to accomplish that. The next thing you have to worry about when you are creating a railroad is you need to create places for them to get off the railroad. One of the hardest things to do is to set something in motion and let the players be the ones that discover it. Instead, it's far easier to continuously do a data dump, pumping information out to them on a regular basis. And I'll be honest, sometimes the railroad car gets unused. You build a story element and you tell the players about it, and then the players go, nah. A great example of this is that in a previous iteration, in a previous life, so to speak, I would go to the game store hours in advance, and I'd get out all the local model terrain and set up a diorama, if you will, of the play area, and I would invite the players to figure out where on the map they want to start, and then they walk through the map discovering what's there as an element of the story. It wasn't meant or intended to be the actual railroad stop, if you will. I was just putting something for them to see. And I cannot tell you how many times the players would come in, take one look at the map, and go, that looks too scary, let's go over there. And they'll point away in the distance, and away they go. So, to be clever, you have to be able to establish these scenes that you want to show in a way that the players actually want to focus their eyes in that direction. And I would say this probably is one of the greatest skills that a game master can develop, is the idea of being able to read what the players want. And it's as capricious as all get out, because sometimes they clearly do want to follow and are willing to leap into the situation, landing with both feet. And then other times they just simply will not. I don't care how much of a shoehorn you try to use, they will not engage with that specific environment locale that you put before them. So again, clever railroad design means that you create a vista that the players will be drawn to go and investigate. This can be done through strong recurring player characters. They can be intense and intentionally mysterious NPCs or RPCs that they run into, so that they feel the need to follow on what's going on in the story. So that's what you need to do to be able to build and create a cleverly created railroad. So between a cleverly created railroad and an established environment that is sandboxy, the combination between those two creates what I in effect call shifting sands, and that is the story does get moved from point A to point B along a timeline that is irrelevant to what the players are doing unless they make it what they're doing. So now we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about something a little bit more dire, and that's the erosion of the play environment in the world today. The advent of established intellectual properties that define what the play environment is fundamentally is the beginning of the erosion of the play environment overall. By that I mean the establishment of a fictional setting like Faerun or Dragonlance, or in my case, the Nikos worldview. These elements, if they are played by a myriad of game masters with a myriad of game master values placed within them, you end up with a very confusing and kind of unforgiving play environment. One of the biggest challenges, I believe, to role-play games as they stand right now is the absolute glut of new information being produced and created for established play lines in such a way that you as a new storyteller are compelled to purchase all of the various pieces in order to continue the game experience. And this causes an erosion because every storyteller is going to put it through the filter of themselves and therefore change the outcome by changing the delivery. And so my personal advocacy is for each game master to utilize the resources, but don't become bound to them. Do not use them to develop the chronology or the drumbeat of your campaign, because you don't necessarily know when you get the new properties whether or not they are going to fit with what you have as a story. And the carte blanche, pick up the module, run it as written, can be really helpful, or it can be a real danger, because if the story elements include things that you're not ready to or do not wish to interact with, you put yourself in a position of having to reverse yourself. You'll have to say, we're going to point X, and then you look it up and realize that point X is going to be a story point that is not going to be conducive to matching up with your world, and therefore you have to say, well, yeah, you can go that way, but it's not going to do anything. I have a very good friend who ran an adventure. It was called The Adventure of the Flaming Hot Pookie Moo Moo. And yes, John Page, if you were out there, I'm talking about you. The concept of that adventure was such that the storyteller had a clearly designed map, had clearly defined rooms, and when the players walked to the edge of the map and tried to walk off of it, he would simply set a new room with 3 doors and nothing in the room, and he would tell them, you're going the wrong way. But without telling them what the right way was or guiding them in any fashion, they would just pick another door. He'd look down at his piece of paper and say, okay, you're once again in a room with 3 doors, nothing else. You're going the wrong way. And so on, and so on, and so on. And if he didn't track them as leading back to the adventure as he had written it, they would be lost in that myriad of empty rooms forever. And while it was kind of funny as an experience, I don't recommend it to anybody, and it just is an example of this erosion that I'm speaking of, because if a villain in one campaign setting is chosen to be the good guy in another of the same printed material campaign, then the players are going to feel frustrated. They're not going to be able to interact with, and then the playground, instead of staying in a sandboxy environment or even a railroad environment, becomes this muddled mess and actually causes players to decide not to interact. You know, the old Rush songs that said that even when you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. The idea here is that you're setting up the world and the ability to play in it to become useless in terms of effective communication session after session, especially if you change up your storyteller and change up the direction. All right, I'm not going to spend too much more time on the erosion because I feel that it's going on and we have to find ways to combat it. Oh, by the way, I do want to mention this fine 3D printed mug was carefully printed and then painted by a very good friend of mine, and so I try to show it in most of my videos to draw attention to his work. And if you are fascinated by or interested with it, you can contact me and I'll put you in touch with the individual who made it and see if he'd make one for you. He does want to get into the printing business, but he doesn't want to advertise, so strangest thing ever. Alrighty, so now we're going to go on to the next section, Satanic Panic and Roleplay Respectability. So now is when I push my teeth back in my mouth and I say, back in my day, the game was a much more dangerous place to be because people believed you could be taken away from your religion and drawn away by the devil and seduced. And I'm telling you from my experience that concept of satanic panic was far less about religious control and much more about political control. Those of you that lived through those 80s and early 90s, the concept, of course, was that the elements of fantasy that are addressed in roleplay games, since they are not within the realm of this terrestrial Earth, usually, they are setting up the players to put their imagination and emotion into a place that may or may not be impacted by powers that are beyond this Earth. Now, that's kind of funny because we as human beings have no evidence, if you will, of the existence of these satanic forces and whatnot. And even those people who ascribe to the concepts of channeling and opening their spirits to these kind of contacts don't necessarily have ways to manifest proofs of them. And so the satanic panic, by and large, was a toothless position. But it did adversely affect the respectability of roleplay. I have to say that the product lines that have come out over time have done their part to further erode this respectability until recently. Now, motion pictures and TV programs like Stranger Things or Community or Big Bang Theory, these all show role-playing games, and in certain cases they do a pretty fair estimation of what happens in a game. But the more strident versions, like the pardon me. Gosh, I can't. Mazes and Monsters was the name of the film. Was a great example, and that very idea put actors in such a position to play untenable things like people that believe or are having a psychological break and believe that fantasy is reality. And while this is a very real mental health issue, and I don't mean to disparage or denigrate that in any way, what really happens in effect is that you throw the baby out with the bathwater when you say that role playing loses its respectability because it somehow foments those erroneous mental images and mental activities. In my experience, and perhaps that's only empiric, but in my experience, role-play games have been a positive impact on people by letting them see the nature of their decisions in context of what happens to the world when you do these things. To me, the biggest challenge is that if we are going to hold a respectable position as role players, we have to hold to the basic tenet that the game originally held, and that was that the players were taking on heroic roles. The idea of them becoming something more than what they were and advancing their culture and their beliefs and their moral standing within the framework is critical, and letting those kind of things fall by the wayside in favor of a more sandboxy, I can do what I want environment is not helpful to role play in general. There are enough people in the world that actually are fighting those battles today that we don't have to do that in a role play environment. And the more we can hold to those basic tenets of goodness and heroism and positive role activities, the better off we will be. And so we want to consider these things as we look forward and try to find ways to, maybe we don't have to fight the satanic panic battles any longer. Maybe we don't even have to fight for role play to be respectable. Nonetheless, we want to make sure that we do not promote those aspects of it that would be seen in an adverse function. And there are products that have been created because of the rights of free speech, but the rights of those products to exist does not mean that we have an obligation to participate in them. So, of course, that's going to lead to the next point. When we are considering the role-play game environment that we are going to role-play in, some of them can be rather edgy. For example, maybe the environment you are playing in is the end of time and the world has already gone to destructive levels, and you're playing within a system that no longer has established law. Or you're playing in a dystopia where you've made the established law figures villains. In these kind of situations, it becomes a matter of ethical consideration for the storyteller to determine how he's going to lead the players along the story towards their inevitable redemption or glory or whatever. The manifestation of a good place for the game masters to take the players in the long term helps and supports and expands the idea of people wanting to become game masters. Whereas if you are going to argue that a player who is going to become a game master has to establish a sandbox that allows for a amoral position or a unethical position as a starting point, if you say that's required, then you're actually doing a disservice to the very concept of role play. And again, back in my day, the idea was you built the story to give the characters a way to improve and become better. And in today's world, it seems like many of the properties are set up so that you play in an evil place and can do as much bad as you want. But there is definitely a positive through story if you only paid attention to it. I'm thinking of Grand Theft Auto, the franchise, which, arguably is in some cases really horrible because it allows people to do carjacking and take over vehicles and be violent with each other and stuff for no apparent reason. And these need to be, if you will, put under the purviews of a storyteller or a game master or somebody who cares about the property enough to help establish the concepts that these are not good environments. And I know that's probably going to get me some negative comments, and I'm more than willing to do so. If you happen to agree with me and think that it's a good thing the players are the heroes and the champions, make sure you leave comments to that effect as well. I'd love to have a conversation start up with those that disagree with me concerning this, because I think that the case that can be made for positive ethical considerations is rather deep and intentional and far less adversarial as that might seem from the position that I'm taking. But okay, you're going to get down to the rant here in just a minute. And when you get to the rant, of course, I stop and give it a couple of minutes to get my time to match with my clock, because I don't want to go over on the rant, because these need to be focused. And as I originally started them at 1 minute rants, that may be impossible. The statement of the rant could certainly take less than a minute, and that may be what I do in the future, but the rant itself is more than likely going to take between 4 and 6 minutes. So just a few more seconds here. Let me hydrate again. All right. Today's rant is on appeal to motive arguments. And let me set the stage. You have a player who you have described a scene to, and their decision is to do something that is unprovoked, rather violent, and will trigger a series of events that will make a playthrough of the scene that will be negative or adverse to your story as storytelling. And the way they do that is as soon as you question them on the justification for their motive, they tap their character sheet, point to a specific point on the sheet, and they say, well, by this, my character's motivation would be to do this. I'm doing this in character. I'm doing this because my character, my piece of paper here, says I should do this. And I want to crash my head into the desk every time I hear that, because the player who comes to the table brings with him a piece of paper that is the defining character sheet. And he, as a player, is manifested on paper for the specifics of die rolling mechanism and that alone. And when a player decides to appeal to what the character would do versus what they would do, they are completely stepping away from the very concept of what roleplay is. This drives me crazy. The purpose of a roleplay environment is for you as the player to step into the position of the character and act according to what you, the player, thinks the character should do. Now, if a person cogently sets that very case up and they say, I am playing the way my character would, and I am doing this thing that is going to be objectionable, or it's going to be violent, or it's going to be aggressive, or it's going to be an interference to the storyline, they've already disconnected from the information that you've provided them, and they are not playing the same game that you are. They are now playing their own game. And they're utilizing your play space to be they're just overtaking your play space to do what they as an individual want to do, and they are writing it off as something the character would do. And it drives me insane, because that's not the way this works. When you are playing a character, the character is you. And if you're going to choose to do a bad thing, then you have to understand the ramifications are going to be placed upon the character based on what you did, not what you think the character might have done. Because you are this, that's synonymous. Now, some people will hear that and they go, but Jonathan, you have the injunction. You say that the player is taking on the role of the character in the story, and that the character's existence is there in advance of and continuous thereafter. This personality is no longer its own, except for in the moments when the player isn't in the room. To which I say this: yes, we are playing a game, for crying out loud. You are playing that role. But you have to take into consideration what it is that you are actually asking to do, and whether or not it meets with the story as defined and the play parameters as defined. And if they fit both of those, then you should be able to build a case for it, and the storyteller would, of course, accept and eventually advocate for that point. But the simple appeal to character motive is problematic, and it doesn't really accomplish anything other than creating a place in the game for there to be an adversary position. Heavy sigh. So the solution to the rant is for the player to become more in tune with what the character is in the game, understand more clearly what the actions of that character will entail, and how the player's persona drives forward the story on those points. And if you step out of character to accomplish something simply to see what the buttons do, you are no longer playing a role play game, but you're instead playing a tune in a arbitrary environment, and you're not actually there in the moment. So Alrighty, I'm going to step down off of my rant table because we've got a few minutes left here, and I want to make sure we definitely get a mention in of the Nikos role-playing game experience on Twitch. Every Saturday at 10 a.m., I will be running a role-playing game for those persons who show up and participate in the chat. Now, if you want to enhance and expand that experience, and you want to become a part of our group in a way so that your voice can be heard as part of our broadcast, then you will want to join our program for Patreon, patreon.com/Nikos. Purchase your or invest or support us at the $20 a month level, and then you are given access to our Discord channel. You are invited to our Sunday Patreon players only online RPG, and you're also given permission to join via voice for the Saturday experiment. If we have none of those and we only have the chat, that'll be fine too. I believe I can accommodate up to 40 or 50 players, and I'd love to be challenged on that. So if you don't think it can be done, by all means call up all your friends and say, let's break this game, let's take over this experiment, because I think you'll be quite pleased with it. Now, we will be using the Nikos RPG mechanism, so if you want an advanced copy of the Nikos RPG game mechanics, you can purchase that at the website nikosrpg.com. Just go to the shop page and purchase the PDF, and you'll instantly have the rules set for the Dark Shards. That's the Nikos RPG fantasy system, and it'll have almost everything you need to actually play. There also is a downloaded PDF character sheet also available from that website. So nikosrpg.com is the place to go for that. Again, if you are just simply wanting to join me on the channel, it'll be this specific Nikos Twitch channel, nikosrpg.com, and I'll be glad to be here early to converse about what's going to be required to get the game up and running. So if you have not experienced any of the Nikos RPG games, you can definitely check out my live streams on the YouTube channel at Nikos RPG. There are, I think, a total of over 300 videos there now of a wide variety, including live play RPG sessions that occurred at the Gameology game store, but now about 2 years back. And there are also sessions that are available via the YouTube channel that are playthroughs and player helps, such as this one. So also, if you really want to support this channel, make sure you here's that term again. You for some reason I'm having a mental block. You can subscribe. There we go. Subscribe to the channel by going down below and clicking the subscribe button on the YouTube channel. You can also subscribe to the podcast, which will get you the automatic uploads of these episodes of Game Master Soapbox that are being put together on the YouTube channel as a podcast, and therefore you can catch up on all the previous episodes and catch up on what we're trying to accomplish. If you want more information, go to patreon.com and become a member there. And of all things, if nothing else, if you like the video, thank you very much, and please click the like button below, because that'll help with the algorithm and get this episode out to more people. If you didn't enjoy the show and you didn't get what you were looking for, definitely leave me a comment so that I can get an idea of what will be helpful to you and what I can bring to the table for you. And I appreciate the time that you have spent with us today. This is Jonathan Albin. I am the host. I'm also Game Master J and Commander Clueless on World of Tanks. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to leave them in the chat, or you can leave them in the comment section below. Thank you very much. I am Jonathan Albin, as I said, and I will see you next time. Bye.